If only I had closed my door that night. That's the thought that haunts me every single day. You see, I'm not the kind of woman who jumps into trouble. I love my job as a media executive, and I love the life I've built with my husband, Chief Adeda, owner of one of the biggest media empires in Nigeria. But somehow, everything started falling apart. That night, Andrew knocked on my door. Andrew wasn't just my stepson, he was one of the most talented investigative journalists I'd ever seen, the kind of person who could smell a lie before it even left your mouth. His work was the stuff of headlines, scandals that shook the country and exposed the biggest secrets. Yet that night, it wasn't about a story, it was about us. I remember it vividly. The newsroom had just wrapped up coverage of a political scandal that could have brought the government to its knees. We were all exhausted, but Andrew stayed back, buried in papers and chasing leads. I admired his dedication, I always had. But that night, something about his intensity drew me in. I told myself I was just checking on him, after all, I was like a mentor to him, right? But the way he looked at me when I walked in. I should have turned back. I should have walked away. But I didn't. Instead, we talked, not about work or politics, but life, his frustrations, my dreams, the pressures we both felt being part of Chief's world. Hours passed like minutes. Before I knew it, we were laughing, sharing secrets we had no business sharing. And then, no, let me not jump ahead. The thing is, in that moment, I forgot who I was, Ella Chitty, media executive, wife to the chief, stepmother to Andrew. I wasn't thinking of the headlines this story would make if it ever got out. I wasn't thinking of the empire that could crumble or the lives that would shatter. All I knew was that something had shifted, and there was no going back. The next morning, I avoided him. I threw myself into work, attending endless meetings and making calls that didn't need to be made. But by evening, there he was again, in the corner of the newsroom, typing furiously on his laptop. His eyes caught mine, and I felt that pull again. "Madam E," he said teasingly as I walked past. It was the nickname he'd given me when we first met, and now hearing it made my stomach flutter. I managed a weak smile and kept walking, but I could feel his gaze follow me. Later that night, I found myself standing outside his door. Why I didn't know. Maybe I wanted to tell him to stop looking at me that way. Maybe I wanted to make sure nothing would happen again. But the moment he opened the door, I knew I'd already lost that battle. "Madam E, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, his usual confidence replaced with something that felt vulnerable. I nodded, but my voice failed me. The air between us was heavy, like both of us were holding our breaths, waiting for someone to say something, anything, that would make this less complicated. But no one did. Instead, we sat in silence, the weight of what we weren't saying pressing down on us. "Ella," he finally said, breaking the silence. He'd never called me by my first name before. Hearing it from him felt strange, like I was someone else entirely. "What are we doing?" I didn't have an answer. I wanted to blame him, blame the long hours, blame Chief for being so distant. But the truth was, I was as much a part of this as he was. Just then, Andrew's phone buzzed, pulling us out of the moment. He glanced at the screen and cursed under his breath. "It's the source," he said, grabbing his laptop. "The one for the minister's story, the one that had the entire newsroom working on eggshells." If Andrew's lead was correct, this would be the biggest expose of the year, a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. "You should go," he said, his voice tense now. "This is big, Ella. I need to focus." I nodded, grateful for the interruption, and left. But as I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Days turned into weeks. The newsroom buzzed with excitement as Andrew's story took shape. Late nights became the norm, and so did our stolen moments, glances across the room, brief conversations that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Then one night, everything changed. Andrew barged into my office, his face pale. "We have a problem," he said, shutting the door behind him. What's wrong? I asked, alarmed. My source, he said, pacing the room. They are threatening to back out, and if they do, the whole story collapses. Chief will kill me if this doesn't go through. I stood up, trying to calm him down. Andrew, relax. We'll figure it out. But he didn't relax. Instead, he stopped pacing and looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race. Ella, I need you to trust me. I need you to back me on this, even if Chief doesn't. The way he said it, the way he looked at me, it wasn't just about the story anymore. He was asking for more, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. I trust you, I said, and I meant it. The next morning, Chief called an emergency meeting. Apparently, someone had leaked information about the story, and the government was pushing back hard. Threats were flying, and the stakes had never been higher. As Chief spoke, my eyes found Andrew across the room. He looked calm, collected, but I knew better. I knew the storm brewing inside him because it mirrored my own. And just like that, the line between us bled even further. The newsroom felt like a war zone that week. Every phone call carried tension, every email was a potential disaster. Chief was furious, pacing the office, barking orders, and demanding answers. The leak story was gaining traction, and the media empire's reputation was at stake. Andrew, on the other hand, remained calm, too calm. While others panicked, he quietly worked, pulling together evidence and tightening his sources. He was determined to see the story through, no matter the cost. But there was one night when everything came crashing down. I was in my office, staring at a blank screen when Andrew walked in. He closed the door softly and stood there, looking at me like he was about to say something important. They know, he said. I froze. Who knows? Chief, he replied. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knows about the story, the leak. My heart stopped for a moment. I couldn't breathe. How did he find out? Who told him? The questions raced through my mind, but none of them mattered. The damage was already done. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Andrew shook his head. I don't know. But I'm not running, Ella. Not from this story and not from us. His words, though bold, made my chest tighten. I knew then that it wasn't just about Chief or the story anymore. This was about choices, choices I had made, choices I couldn't take back. Later that night, Chief confronted me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the disappointment in his eyes was louder than any shout could have been. He didn't need to say much, his silence said it all. Ella, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. You've let me down, not just as my wife, but as someone I trusted. I wanted to defend myself, to explain, but what was there to say? I had crossed a line I never should have crossed, and now everything was unraveling. The fallout was swift. Chief demanded that Andrew leave the company. The story, while published, came with heavy scrutiny, and the media empire barely survived the storm. As for me, I stayed, but things were never the same. Advice for women, sisters, listen to me. Sometimes the lines between right and wrong are blurred by emotion, by passion, by loneliness. But no matter how hard life gets, no matter how tempting the moment, think about the bigger picture. One choice, just one, can change everything. Protect your peace, guard your heart, and above all, never forget who you are.